What happens when the two people you trust the most betray you in the worst way possible? Can a friendship survive a betrayal that shatters everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty? Sarah thought she had it all, until the day she uncovered a secret that left her reeling, and her world crumbled. But what she did next will make you question everything you thought you knew about forgiveness, strength, and the true cost of friendship. Sarah had always believed her marriage to Ben was the kind of love people dreamed of. They'd been together for over 7 years, and in those years, they had built a life filled with shared memories and promises. Yet recently something felt off. Ben had become distant. His usual warmth had turned into silence, and his late nights at work had grown more frequent. But Sarah pushed it aside, convincing herself that it was just the pressures of life. Nothing more, nothing less. She had always been the type to keep things together, to focus on the good, even when it seemed like the cracks were starting to show. Her best friend Emily had noticed it too. They'd been friends since college, and over the years Emily had become a constant in Sarah's life. Emily always knew how to make Sarah laugh, how to lift her spirits. Yet lately, even Emily had seemed different. There was a certain coldness in her eyes whenever they spoke about Ben, and she had stopped visiting Sarah as often as she used to. Sarah chalked it up to her busy schedule and the fact that Emily had been caught up in her own complicated love life. But deep down, something didn't sit right. One evening after work, Sarah came home to find the house unusually quiet. Ben's car was in the driveway, but he wasn't in the living room. She thought he might be in the bedroom, but the door was closed. Something about the closed door felt off, like it was meant to keep her out. She stood there for a moment, unsure if she should knock or just wait. But instead of knocking, she slowly turned the handle. The moment she stepped inside, her entire world flipped upside down. There in her own bed was Ben, tangled in the sheets with Emily. They weren't just sitting there, they were all over each other. The scene was so raw, so real, that Sarah couldn't comprehend what she was seeing at first. Ben's eyes widened. As soon as he saw her, his face drained of color. Emily's expression mirrored his, shock, guilt, and something else. But it wasn't enough to hide the truth. Sarah froze, unable to process the scene before her. Her heart hammered in her chest, and for a split second she thought she might be dreaming. But the weight of the moment was too heavy to be a dream. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat, then turned and walked out of the room, without saying a word. The cold air hit her as she stepped outside, and she walked aimlessly down the street. She didn't know where she was going or what she was doing, but the images of Ben and Emily, intertwined in betrayal, burned in her mind. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't look at it. Ben's name flashed on the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. Not yet. Sarah's mind raced. How long had this been going on? Had Emily always been this way? Had she been deceived by both of them for so long? Her thoughts were a blur of anger, disbelief, and confusion. She had trusted them, both of them. Emily had been her closest friend, the one person she turned to for advice, for comfort. And Ben? He was supposed to be her rock. How could they do this to her? She needed to understand. She needed answers. As she walked in a daze, her phone rang again. This time it was Emily's name that flashed on the screen. Sarah's hand trembled as she held the phone in her palm, but she didn't answer. Instead, she kept walking, leaving. The buzzing sound behind her. She didn't go far before stopping at a small park by the side of the road. The evening was quiet, and the silence around her only heightened the chaos inside. She sat on a bench, staring at the streetlights flickering. In the distance, her emotions were all over the place: anger, hurt, humiliation. But what struck her the most was how calm she felt, almost detached, as if everything had already happened and there was nothing left to do but watch the wreckage unfold. The more Sarah thought about it, the less she understood. Why would Ben, her husband, betray her like this? What was so special about Emily that she would throw away years of friendship? Was it something she had done wrong? No, it wasn't her fault. She had given everything to both of them. The idea that she had been so blind to what was happening right under her nose made her sick to her stomach. But then, as the cold night air wrapped around her, something else crept in, a feeling she hadn't expected. Empowerment, for the first time in years. Sarah realized that she wasn't the weak one in this situation. It wasn't her fault that Ben had turned away from her, that Emily had crossed a line. She didn't need either of them. They thought they could break her. But in that moment, Sarah felt like she could rebuild herself, stronger than before. The thought made her heart race with a strange sense of excitement. She stood up from the bench, took a deep breath, and made a decision. Tomorrow she would confront them. But it wouldn't be a confrontation of anger or despair. It would be something else. Sarah didn't know what yet, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to beg for answers. She was done being the victim. The following morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee as if nothing had happened. She was calm, too calm. Her mind was clear, focused. She had spent the night thinking about what she had seen and how she wanted to handle it. She wasn't going to let them see her fall apart. Not Ben, not Emily. They'd already done enough damage. Ben arrived home in the late afternoon, his face full of hope, as if nothing had changed. As soon as he walked through the door, he could tell something was different. Sarah didn't run to him like she usually did. She didn't greet him with a smile or a soft touch. She was sitting at the table reading a magazine, her face unreadable. Ben tried to smile, but it faltered as he walked closer to her. "Sarah," he started, but his voice caught in his throat. "We need to talk." Sarah didn't look up from the magazine. "I know," she said quietly. Ben stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. He cleared his throat, trying to muster some courage. I can't explain." "Explain," Sarah repeated, her voice calm, almost detached. She set the magazine down and finally looked at him. "You don't need to explain, Ben. I saw everything." His face drained of color, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Sarah, I didn't mean for this to happen. It just—" "Stop," Sarah interrupted. "I'm done hearing excuses." She stood up from the table and walked to the living room, leaving Ben standing behind her, his mouth opening and closing, unsure of how to fix this. But Sarah wasn't giving him the chance to fix anything. Ben followed her, his eyes pleading. "Please, Sarah, just let me explain. I've been confused, okay? I didn't know what I was doing, and then I never wanted to hurt you." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes cold. "You've been confused?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with bitterness. "I don't want to hear that, Ben. You've been lying to me. To both of us. And Emily." She paused, her anger rising. "I can't believe you would do this with her. She's supposed to be my best friend." Ben stepped forward, his hands outstretched, but Sarah took a step back, putting space between them. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I am, but I don't know how to fix this. I love you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Love me?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but the venom in it was undeniable. "You've broken me, Ben. I thought I knew you. I thought we had something. Real. Something no one could break. But you did this." She turned away, unable to look at him anymore. "I don't need your love anymore. It means nothing now." Ben's eyes filled with panic. "Sarah, please, we can work through this. We can go to therapy. We can fix it." But Sarah shook her head slowly, her face resolute. "It's too late for that. I don't want to fix this. I want to move on." And just like that, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to let Ben or Emily hold any more power over her. She wasn't broken. She was free. The anger, the hurt, it would fade in time. But for now, she was done playing the victim. The days that followed were a blur for Sarah. She had left Ben, but the weight of the decision didn't hit her right away. Instead, she felt a strange calmness, as if the chaos of the last few days had removed the noise from her life, leaving only silence. At first, the silence was suffocating, but soon it became a comfort. Ben tried reaching out every day, calls, texts, emails, but Sarah didn't respond. His messages ranged from pleading to apologetic, but none of it moved her. There were no more tears left to shed over him, no more regret. He had made his choice, and now she had to make hers. Emily, on the other hand, was relentless. She would show up at Sarah's door unannounced, her face red with frustration and guilt. She'd tried calling too, but the moment Sarah picked up, she would hang up, feeling too overwhelmed to speak. Emily's guilt was written all over her face every time she tried to explain, but Sarah wasn't having any of it. One afternoon, Emily cornered Sarah outside her apartment, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant for this to happen. I was confused too. You have to understand, She choked on her words, her body trembling with regret. Sarah looked at her, arms crossed, and felt something shift inside her. Part of her wanted to scream at Emily, to accuse her of all the hurt she had caused. But another part of her, the part she was learning to trust, felt no anger toward Emily. She just felt empty. It was as if Emily no longer existed in the same space as her past. "You were confused?" Sarah asked, her voice flat. "Well, I'm done being confused for you, Emily. I don't need your apologies. I don't need your explanations. What you did was your choice. You made it, and now you have to live with it." Emily's face crumpled. But Sarah didn't wait around to watch. She turned her back on her and walked away, not looking back, not feeling sorry. This was it. Emily had lost her place in Sarah's life. In the quiet of her apartment later that night, Sarah realized something. She wasn't angry. She wasn't devastated anymore. What she felt was something much more powerful. Freedom. She could breathe again. It was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Ben and Emily, the people she thought she could never live without, had turned out to be the very ones who had suffocated her. Now without them, she could finally find out who she really was again. Her mind wandered to her past, the moments she had buried deep inside herself, the dreams she had put on hold, the things she loved doing before life had pulled her in different directions. Now it felt like a chance for a fresh start, and she was determined not to let it slip away. She called her best friend from years ago, someone she had lost touch with over the years. They hadn't talked in ages, but Sarah knew it was time to reconnect. She was no longer the woman who needed validation from a man or anyone else. She was Sarah, and she would carve her own path. It had been a month since Sarah had left Ben. The apartment felt more like her sanctuary now. Quiet, peaceful. Sarah had settled into a new routine. She had thrown herself into her work, focused on her passions again. She started painting again, something she used to love. The strokes on the canvas became her way of processing everything, every emotion, every betrayal, every moment of pain. Each piece was a step closer to healing, and she found solace in the simplicity of creating. Her decision to cut Ben and Emily out of her life wasn't easy at first, but now it felt like the right one. No regrets. She had no space for toxic relationships anymore. The months of silence from Ben and Emily had given her the clarity she needed. It was no longer about what they wanted from her. It was about what she wanted for herself. One evening, while Sarah was out for a walk, she bumped into an old acquaintance, Lucas. He was someone she had known from her college years, a man she had always shared an easy chemistry with, though they had never taken things further. He was charming, smart, and kind. Everything Ben hadn't been for her in the last few years. Lucas had heard about what had happened, and instead of offering pity, he gave Sarah space to talk, or not talk. He never pressed her about her breakup. Instead, he respected her need for time, but he also didn't hide the fact that he found her more interesting and beautiful than ever. Their friendship rekindled quickly. Lucas became someone Sarah looked forward to spending time with. It was different than with Ben. There was no pressure, no pretending, just two people enjoying each other's company without expectations. Sarah found herself laughing again, something she hadn't done freely in a long time. But Lucas wasn't the only person who noticed Sarah's transformation. Her family saw it too, her parents, her sister. They all told her how proud they were of her, how strong she had been through everything. They all saw the fire in her that had been dimmed for so long, and now it was burning brightly again. Sarah realized with a sense of satisfaction that this wasn't just about Ben and Emily. It was about her reclaiming herself. She began to date again, but this time it was on her terms. She wasn't looking for validation. She wasn't looking for a man to complete her. She was looking for someone who would complement her, someone who could see her for who she truly was, not as the wife or the best friend, but as Sarah. Lucas didn't rush her. He wasn't trying to replace Ben. Instead, he respected her pace, and they enjoyed the moments they shared together without any rush to define what they were. Sarah wasn't sure where things would go with him, but for the first time in a long while she felt open to whatever came next. Her life was taking on a new direction, one that was hers to shape. The power to decide, to move forward, and to leave the past behind, it was all hers, and it was exhilarating. A few weeks had passed since Sarah had embraced her new life. She was thriving, painting again, reconnecting with friends, and feeling a sense of independence she hadn't felt in years. She was learning to enjoy the small things again, like morning coffee by the window, late-night conversations with Lucas, and the freedom to make her own decisions without worrying about someone else's feelings. But just when everything seemed perfect, Ben made a surprise reappearance. Sarah had expected it at some point, but not like this. It was late one evening when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it, but something inside her told her to pick it up. When she did, the voice on the other end sent a chill down her spine. "Sarah, it's Ben." His voice was trembling, unsure, yet filled with urgency. "I need to see you. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but please just hear me out. There's something you need to know." She stared at the phone for a moment, her mind racing. For a long time, she had wondered if Ben would ever come back to apologize, to beg for her forgiveness. But she had learned to shut that door long ago. She didn't need him to feel whole anymore. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. Part of her, just a small part, wanted to know why he was calling now after everything. Why now after weeks of silence? "Why are you calling me now, Ben?" she asked, her voice calm, guarded. "What could you possibly say that I haven't already heard?" "Please just meet me," he begged, his words frantic. "It's important. I can't explain everything over the phone, but there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you before." Sarah hesitated, her grip tightening. On the phone. She could feel the weight of the past threatening to swallow her up, but she resisted the urge to go back. She had moved on. She didn't need any more closure, no more excuses, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. His voice wasn't the same. There was an edge to it, something raw, something almost desperate. She agreed to meet him. She told herself it was just for closure, nothing more, but even as she said the words, a part of her knew she wasn't fully prepared for whatever Ben had to say. They met at a small cafe, a neutral place where they could sit in silence if needed. Sarah arrived first, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, trying to steady her nerves. She had done so well to move past this, to live a life that was finally hers again. She couldn't afford to let Ben, or the past, disrupt it. Ben showed up a few minutes later, his face strained and pale, like someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. His eyes met hers, filled with regret, and for the first time since their breakup, Sarah saw a glimmer of the man she had once loved. It was fleeting, but it was there, guilt and sadness mixed with a deep sense of loss. "Thank you for meeting me," Ben said quietly, taking a seat across from her. He didn't immediately speak, as though he was weighing his words, unsure of where to begin. Sarah didn't want to hear it. She had moved on. She was done with this chapter, but still, her curiosity pricked at her. She waited, giving him space, to say whatever it was that had brought him here. Sarah, I don't know how to say this, but I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about the affair, about everything. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but what I'm about to tell you, I need you to understand why I did what I did." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The last thing she had expected was him to explain the affair. She had expected apologies, maybe even more excuses, but this was different. His tone was serious, almost pleading. "Ben," she said, her voice steady but distant, "we're past this. There's nothing you can say to make this better." Ben shook his head, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. Sarah pulled away, but he didn't give up. "Please, Sarah, I need you to hear me out. It wasn't just the affair, there was something else, something that happened right after you left, something I didn't know how to handle." Sarah frowned. Her mind raced. "What are you talking about?" "I found out something," Ben said, his voice cracking. "Something that changed everything. The night you walked out, I was in shock, but I didn't know what I was about to discover. Sarah, Emily, she wasn't just my affair partner. She was hiding something from me, too. She had her own secrets, and when I found out, when I finally put everything together, I realized it was all a lie." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What was he saying? A lie? Emily had lied to him, too, he continued, his words spilling out faster now, desperate for her to understand. "After you left, Emily came to me. She begged me to keep quiet about something she had been hiding. She was pregnant, Sarah, and the child, it wasn't mine." A cold wave washed over Sarah. Her world tilted once more, but this time it wasn't with anger. It was with shock. "What?" she whispered. "You're saying she lied to you too?" Ben nodded, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "I had no idea, I swear to you. She came to me after everything happened and told me that she'd gotten involved with someone else, someone she never told me about. I couldn't believe. I didn't know what to do." The air between them hung heavy with the weight of his words. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Ben's betrayal was still raw, but now there was something else, something that made her question everything. She thought she knew. Emily had lied to him, manipulated him too. It wasn't just Sarah who had been blindsided. Ben's face was a mask of regret. "I was wrong, Sarah. I was an idiot for ever thinking that I could be with her. But the truth is I've been a fool. I wanted to fix things with you, but I didn't know how to say the truth. I should have told you everything before." Sarah sat back, her mind reeling. The world she thought she understood was unraveling, and it was hard to know what was real anymore. She had left Ben thinking he was the sole betrayer, but now Now she saw the cracks in the walls of the world they had built together. The trust was gone, shattered in ways she couldn't have imagined. The shock of the revelation hit her harder than anything Ben had ever said. But it wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about the affair. The story they had shared together was finished. "Thank you for telling me, Ben," she said quietly, her voice cold and calm. "But it doesn't change anything. I'm done. And this time I'm really done." Ben's face fell, but Sarah could see it in his eyes. He was no longer fighting for her. The truth had come too late. And for Sarah, that was the final piece she needed. It was over, for good. She stood up, her heart steady as she walked away, leaving behind a past that no longer had a place in her future. The past had its hold on her, but now Sarah knew how to let go. And as she stepped out into the world again, she realized something important. Sometimes the hardest truth was the one that set you free. Weeks passed, and Sarah's life continued to evolve in ways she hadn't expected. She had found a rhythm now, and it was one that didn't revolve around the chaos of Ben or Emily. The weight of their betrayal still lingered, but with every day that passed, Sarah felt it grow lighter. She was learning how to live for herself. Again, she started to embrace the small things in life, simple pleasures that had once been overshadowed by the need to please Ben or keep Emily happy. She found peace in her morning jogs, in the quiet moments spent reading in the park, in the fresh air that filled her lungs when she stepped outside. She was rediscovering who she was without the baggage of her past relationships. Her work life flourished as well. Sarah had always been a driven woman, but her heart had never been fully in her career before. She'd always balanced her life with her marriage and friendships, putting her own dreams on the back burner. But now, with all the distractions gone, she found herself pouring energy into her projects like never before. One evening, as she was putting the finishing touches on a piece, she got a message. It was from Lucas, the man who had become a steady presence in her life since Ben's betrayal. He wasn't like Ben, or anyone from her past. Lucas was calm, patient, and understanding. He never rushed her or pushed her. He simply accepted her as she was, flawed yet whole. He admired her strength and never tried to fix her, only to support her. "Hey," the message read, "I was thinking about you. I know it's been a while, but if you ever feel like talking or just hanging out, I'm here." Sarah smiled to herself. It had been a long time since she had felt this way, light, unburdened. She replied quickly, her fingers tapping on the screen with ease. "Thanks, Lucas. I'd like that." Their friendship had turned into something more, though it wasn't a rush. It was gentle, like the sunrise after a long, dark night. There were no expectations, no pressure. Sarah was comfortable in her own skin now, and with Lucas, she didn't feel the need to be anything other than who she was. She could feel herself opening up again, something she hadn't done in so long. Lucas wasn't the man she had expected to heal her heart, but he was exactly what she needed. He was a reminder that love didn't have to be complicated, that it didn't have to come with strings attached. He liked her for who she was, not for the woman she had been with Ben. And for the first time in years, Sarah didn't feel like she was settling. She was choosing this new chapter on her terms. But even as things seemed to be falling into place, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the past was never truly behind her. Sometimes late at night, she would find herself replaying moments from her life with Ben and Emily, questioning the choices that had led her here. But those were fleeting thoughts, quickly swept away by the certainty that she was no longer the same person who had been betrayed. She had become someone stronger, someone who could weather the storms and keep moving forward. One chilly Saturday afternoon, Sarah decided to visit a local art gallery. It had been a while since she had gotten out of the house to see the work of other artists, and she felt a growing sense of inspiration to see the world through someone else's eyes. She wandered through the rooms, admiring the vibrant pieces on display, her mind absorbing every detail of the colors, textures, and emotions. It was exactly what she needed. Something outside of herself, something that had nothing to do with the ghosts of her past. As she turned a corner, she stopped in her tracks. There, standing by one of the larger paintings, was Ben. Her heart skipped, and for a moment she froze. It felt like time had stopped. He hadn't noticed her yet, but Sarah was acutely aware of his presence. She hadn't seen him in weeks, and although the idea of seeing him again had crossed her mind, she never expected it to happen like this. He looked the same, but there was something different in his posture, something that spoke of regret, of a man who had been carrying the weight of his actions for far too long. Sarah's first instinct was to turn and leave, to walk out of the gallery and pretend she hadn't seen him, but she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and approached him slowly. She didn't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that she had finally found her peace and was no longer afraid of facing him. She wasn't the same person who had fallen apart when she saw him with Emily. She had moved on, but this moment felt like a strange sort of closure. "Ben," she said quietly, her voice steady. He turned, and for a moment, his face lit up with the slightest glimmer of hope, but it quickly faded when he saw the indifference in her eyes. "Sarah," he said softly. His voice was heavier now, no longer filled with excuses. "I didn't expect to see you here." Sarah shook her head slightly. "I didn't expect to see you either." They stood there for a moment, the silence thick between them. Ben took a hesitant step closer, but Sarah held her ground. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything. I was selfish. I was blind. I hurt you, and I've regretted it every day since." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel anger. She didn't feel sadness. She just felt nothing. The weight of his apology was there, but it didn't change the past. It couldn't. "You're not the person I thought you were, Ben," she said calmly. "And I'm not the person I used to be either." Ben nodded, slowly as though he understood, but there was no bitterness in her words. There was no desire to get revenge, no urge to make him feel the pain he had caused her. Instead, there was simply the truth. She had moved on. She was stronger than she had ever been, and nothing he could say would change that. "You don't have to forgive me," he said, his voice full of resignation. "I just needed you to know how sorry I am." Sarah didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, and for the first time in years she felt a strange peace. Ben had hurt her, yes, but he no longer had a place in her life. And that was enough. "Goodbye, Ben," she said softly. "I wish you well." And with that, Sarah turned and walked away, leaving Ben behind. She didn't need closure. She didn't need him to apologize. She had everything she needed right. Where she was, her new life, her freedom, and the strength to move forward. As she left the gallery and stepped back into the world, Sarah realized that sometimes the hardest part of moving on wasn't leaving the past behind. It was learning to embrace the future, and she was finally ready to do that. The days after her encounter with Ben were quieter, but the peace Sarah had been chasing for months now felt real. She no longer questioned the choices she'd made or the path she was on. She had learned to forgive herself, something that had seemed impossible when she was still tied up in the pain of betrayal. Now she looked forward to each new day, knowing that whatever happened, she was strong enough to face it. Her art continued to flourish, and the gallery where she'd shown her work before asked her to prepare for a solo exhibition. It was a dream come true. Sarah had never thought of herself as one of those artists whose work would be displayed for all to see, but now it felt like the natural next step in her journey. She poured herself into her paintings with a renewed sense of purpose, creating pieces that spoke of her personal rebirth, vibrant, bold, and free from the constraints of her past. With each brushstroke, she was releasing more of the old Sarah, the one defined by her relationship with Ben, and embracing the woman she was becoming. There were days when she still thought of him, when the memories of their time together tried to creep in, but those thoughts no longer had power over her. She wasn't looking back anymore. She was too busy creating a future of her own. One evening, as she sat in her studio working on a new piece, Lucas dropped by to check on her progress. He had been a steady presence in her life since the breakup, and their relationship had evolved into something comfortable and genuine. It wasn't rushed, but there was no denying the chemistry between them. Lucas wasn't the man who would complete her, that much Sarah was sure of, but he was a partner in her life now, someone who walked beside her, not ahead or behind her. "Looking good," he said, his eyes scanning the canvas. "You've come a long way, Sarah. I'm proud of you." His words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just his praise, it was the recognition that Sarah had finally found herself again. The woman who had walked away from Ben, the one who had started over, had become something more. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. "It's been a long road, but I think I'm finally getting to a place where I can really be myself again." "You're already there," he said, taking her hand and giving it a gentle squeeze. And in that moment, Sarah realized that Lucas was right. She had already arrived at the place she'd been searching for all along, the place where she was complete, without needing anyone else to validate her worth. She was enough, just as she was. The future was wide open, and for the first time she was eager to see where it would take her. But as they stood there in the quiet of the night, Sarah realized something else, that she hadn't done it for him. She hadn't done it for anyone else. She had done it for herself. And that was all that mattered. The past was behind her and the future was hers to create. And as she looked toward the horizon, Sarah knew that whatever came next, she was ready.